All right, everyone, welcome back to Intro to Insect Taxonomy. Today we're going to go into part two, which is a discussion of phylogenetic trees and cladograms and things like that. So if you aren't familiar with those words, we will be going through all of it. So yesterday we kind of left off with this, so the hierarchy of categorization in taxonomy and phylogenetics and things like that, where we go from the broadest group to the narrowest group. The narrowest group being, for our concerns, will be species. So it'll be like Apis mellifera, which represents the genus and species, and this would be the honeybee. But for the majority of what we're going to be talking about, we're going to be focusing a lot on kind of the stuff here, and a little bit at the beginning about the stuff in the phylum. So the phylum will be the arthropods, and then we're going to go into class Insecta, and then we want to go through all of the different orders of the insects. So these are all the major groups. So we have the beetles, and the bees, and the butterflies, and things like that. So all the different kinds, and the mantids, so like praying mantis and its relatives. And we will eventually discuss some stuff in families. There are, over 1,000 families of insects, something like that. And we're not going to go through all of them because, oh my god. But we will go through some of the major families. So like the scarabs and, we'll talk about the apids and the formicids and stuff like that. So like the scarab beetles, the bees and their, like the honeybees and their relatives, the ants and their relatives, stuff like that. So the ones that everyone should be familiar with if you're interested in entomology. And we're not going to go over, all of the absolutely rare tropical families that you're probably never going to see in your arthropods. Can I spell there? All the rare tropical families that you'll probably never see in your life, stuff like that. So the question then comes up, if we want to talk about these things, how do we represent the relationship between the various orders and the various families and even the different species within a family? How do we represent that relationship? How do we talk about those relationships? How do we visualize those relationships? Because within within class Insecta, there is probably 10 million species. I think there's currently 1.5 million named species, but every year we find thousands and thousands of more brand new species. So the estimate is probably there's about 10 million on Earth, ever increasing, hopefully. So how do we talk about the relationships between all of these things? And the way we visualize them are with something called phylogenetic trees, the most common probably being a cladogram, which is a cladistic diagram. When we talk about cladistics, the root word here is clade, and what a clade is just a group of related species. So there's a lot of verbose wordage in all of this, but clade is something that you'll hear quite a bit. But don't let that throw you off. But like clade is a grouping, the actual definition here is a grouping that includes a common ancestor and all the descendants living and extinct of that ancestor. So it's basically a family, not this kind of family, but the like your family, family of interrelated species. So you have probably seen these before. This is kind of like the tree of life sort of diagrams. Those are phylogenetic trees and phylogenetic trees. And the phylogenetic trees come in lots of different shapes, depending on the research that's being done with them. But it's basically just describing the relationship between groups of organisms. So this one here is for vertebrata. The vertebrata are things with backbones or bones with spines, stuff like that. So the first group here, this is the root. The first modern group of these that is still alive are the jawless fish. So this is like the hagfish and the lampreys. Then you have the non-bony fish, like sharks, the cartilaginous fish. then you have the bony fish. So variation, the root would be the most primitive, and this would theoretically be the most advanced, although we're using these words loosely. Everything has had the same amount of time to evolve. Usually when we're talking about primitive to advanced, we're talking about how late did that group show up? Like how recently did that group of organisms show up? And theoretically, in most cladograms, when we're at the tips here, these are species that are still alive, or species that entire groups that no longer exist and have gone extinct entirely. And down at the nodes, this is where you have the branching. So this is, you can think of it as the last common ancestor between groups. So at some point, the sharks, the cartilaginous fish, diverged from the jawless fish, which are like the hagfish and the lampreys. And then eventually out of the cartilaginous fish and the bony fish also had a common ancestor, and the bony fish branched off. And then you have the rise of the amphibians. So these are the frogs, the toads, the salamanders, the newts, things like that. And then later you have the rising of down here will be the dinosaurs and the mammals, the small mammals. So small mammals existed with the dinosaurs. You have like small rat-like creatures that diverged from the dinosaurs. And then the dinosaurs went extinct, but they left behind their descendants, which are the reptiles and the birds. Birds are technically dinosaurs. So you've seen these, I can almost guarantee that you've seen a diagram like this before. So it's not super new. Maybe you just didn't know what it was called, but it's called a cladogram or a phylogenetic tree. Sometimes in research, if you read like research paper or anything about biology, they'll be represented in a couple different ways, most commonly. Sometimes they're horizontal, and sometimes they're vertical. But these two, although they look different, are actually represent the same thing. So it would be like this is species A and species B and species C. It'd be species A and species B and species C. These, although they are different shapes, they represent the same pattern. So you have a common splitting ancestor here, and then you have another common splitting ancestor here, and you have the terminal species here. Terminal meaning at the end of the branch, not something like terminal cancer or anything like that. We're just talking about the end of something. Interestingly, if we look at this one, if we wanted to represent it a different way, if we drew, this, and called this C and this B and this A, it's the same thing. Basically, all of the nodes can be rotated, around. It doesn't matter what the direction of that node is. So this is the same as this, because you can kind of spin around the nodes. So the nodes don't have to be fixed in a cladogram. You're just looking at the relationship between organisms. And like a family tree, let's clean some of this up. Like a family tree that you might have in your family, the closer the branch points are, the more closely related the species at the end of the terminal is, or the terminal species are. So B and C are more closely related to each other than they are to A, but A is related to B and C. So it'd be the same as if you had, this is grandma down here. Grandma gave rise to a couple kids. This is kid one. This is your dad, and this is you, and this is your sister, and this is your aunt who never had kids. It's a similar relationship. It's not an exact metaphor. Obviously, grandma didn't die, off. Well, I mean, maybe your grandma, it did die, but, it's a metaphor, but the tree of life works similar to a family tree. So, Other concepts that we need to talk about are monophyly, paraphyly, and polyphyly. Phyly referring to the phylogenetics of this situation. So sometimes, what would you say? We give names to groups that aren't necessarily all-encompassing of that group. It doesn't necessarily mean that everything in that group is related. And this is a problem because we're constantly revising the relationship between organisms. There's so many organisms. We're constantly trying to figure out their relationships to each other. And so that's why phylogenetics exists. Phylogenetics, by the way, is the study of the evolutionary relationship between organisms. And the way that what phylogenetics looks at is this. Yeah, there we go. So phylogenetics is looking at relationships between organisms. And what they look at are their genetics and their physical characteristics. So they're physical characters. So historically, we only had physical characters to look at. We didn't have advanced genetics until, advanced until recently, but we didn't start looking at the genetics of things until the 90s for the most part, the 1990s. And so genetics had to catch up with what we were already doing with the physical characteristics. But what ended up happening is the more we looked at genetics, the more we realized that some of the physical characteristics couldn't be trusted. So now phylogeneticists look at both genetics and physical characteristics and will generate groups based off of both of them. And sometimes those trees conflict, and so then you have to figure out what's going on. So because of this, we have a couple different concepts. Monophyly is when everything within a group, a named group, or within a branch of a phylogenetic tree, all falls within the same name, or the name encompasses everything in the group, would be a better way of saying it. So like Simiformes are all of the monkeys. All of the monkeys and all of the apes. So that includes the New World monkeys, the Old World monkeys, the apes, and the humans. Paraphyly is when something is missing. So when we're talking about the prosimians, we're talking about kind of the basal groups, the lemurs, the lorises, and the tarsiers. I'm kind of getting out of screen here. So with the prosimians, this is paraphyletic means that it includes most of the things within the group, but may be missing a branch. So it includes this node and all of its descendants, but it only includes part of this node and its descendants. So the tarsiers are included in this group, but it's missing all of the Simiformes. So this tends to happen quite a bit. Paraphyletic groups are fairly common at the higher levels of named groups. So what we will look at probably next time is the pancrustaceans. The Pancrustacea is a very large group that includes all the crustaceans and all of the hexapods, which includes all of the insects. But insects are in the pancrustaceans, but crustaceans are not in the insects. So when we talk about crustaceans, Crustacea is a paraphyletic group. Because it doesn't include everything in the crustaceans, but it does include some of the things that are very closely related to the insects, and so you end up with a diagram where like this is the crustaceans and these are the insects, which is what you see here with the prosimians and the Simiformes here. More rare are the polyphyly, where you have a name that refers to a group of animals that come from two entirely different branches that are not closely related, which is what you see here in red. Generally speaking, in modern phylogenetics, we have tried to do away with polyphyletic groups polyphyletic group names because it generates a lot of confusion in why things are called the way they are because the name of a group will not refer to things which are related. So it becomes very confusing. We will talk about this a little bit next time with monophyly and paraphyly. But just know that these words exist. Next time I bring them up, I will remind you about what these things mean, but they are important concepts in phylogenetics. So as for what we're going to be talking about in this this course, so this is a phylogenetic tree of the insects, of the hexapods in general, but mostly this is insects. So you can see, here's the root down here. The root is in the center, and it goes out. I'll show you. Move over here a little bit. Let me zoom out. There's a lot of insects, as you can see. The root goes out this way, and then it will go clockwise. That's how you can read this evolutionary relationship, where the most primitive hexapods are down here. So like the Diplura, the Protura, and the springtails are not true insects. These are Entonatha. They're called the entonaths. And then the real insects start here with bristletels and silverfish, and they become more evolutionarily advanced as we go around this way, where you end up with things like the butterflies and moths, the micromoths, the caddisflies, the houseflies. What else do you have here? Fleas, mosquitoes, beetles, all these. So the real kind of big line here is going to be, let's make this a thicker line so we can actually see it. So you can see the progression here. So there's a big block off here where you have the entonates here, and then that go into the true insects. And then where do you have it here? You have a line kind of here where you have the hemimetabolous insects on one side, hemimetabolous, and the homometabolous insects on the other side. So hemimetabolous insects are creatures or insects which do not undergo complete metamorphosis. They don't have a larval stage. They're basically small insects that grow into larger versions of themselves. So think grasshoppers and stink bugs and stuff like that. And then the homometabolous insects are insects that go through metamorphosis. So these are things which have a larval stage. So like butterflies, moths, beetles, wasps. These all have a larval stage. They go through a pupation and then become the adult. There's also kind of a big division here in the hexapods, where you have the apterous hexapods and the winged hexapods. So the silverfish and the bristletails and then all the entonates, they never develop wings. So ptero, when I say apterous, ptero means wings. Atero is without wings. And so they're the apterous insects. And then with the rise of the mayflies and the dragonflies, you suddenly start seeing, in this very primitive groups, the mayflies and the dragonflies, you suddenly start seeing insects with wings. At different points in this tree, and you can see how many branches this tree has, insects will lose their wings, and that's called secondary wing loss, secondary evolution, where the creatures evolved a characteristic, and then later on they lose that characteristic because it's no longer useful for them. So like fleas up here, fleas, although very closely related to the flies, don't have wings. They don't need the wings because they're parasitic and they can jump really well. They don't really need to fly around. So you can see just how many branches are in here, and each of these branches represents thousands of species. Like I've said before, the insects are estimated to be probably 10 million species strong, and we know 1.5 million now, about 1.5 million. But if we're talking about, and this is just as an interesting point, if we're talking about all life on Earth, insects are like 80% of animals. Trying to draw with my mouse is difficult. So insects represent 80% of animals, but they only represent maybe 10% of the life on Earth. If you want to talk about like all the life on Earth, this is kind of what it looks like. This is at least the eukaryotic tree. So below this line, these are the bacteria below that line. Let me make this smaller again so I can write better. And then above this line are the eukaryotes. So this side are the eukaryotes. These are or creatures with cells which have nuclei and other cell organelles. So down here are the prokaryotes, so these are the bacteria, and the archaea bacteria we talked about last time. These are the really primitive bacteria that live in like hot springs and stuff like that. So then you have all the eukaryotic life on Earth. The insects are represented by a tiny little branch right here. These are the insects. And you can see how much more there is. You have all of the fungi, all of the animals, and this is all of the plants. That's all the mushrooms and fungi, all the animals, all the plants, and then all of this other stuff are extremely various, mostly single-celled organisms. If you ever have a chance to learn about protists, you will go through a lot of these groups. They are extremely interesting. They're extremely diverse. They're very alien. If you've probably never heard of most of these things. You've probably never seen anything like these things. They're very, very interesting. So when we're talking about the insects and we talk about, there's so many of them, they're really just, they're the largest branch of animals, but when you begin looking at all the different kinds of life on Earth, there's still only a small fraction of everything that's going on. And with that, next time we'll talk about the arthropods in general and their relationships and all the different major categories of arthropods. And I'll see you then.